Hi, my name is Tom Rice-Oxley. I'm a composer based in the UK, and in this video we're going to be looking at Contrapunctus No. 1 from Bach's The Art of Fugue. We're using an edition that uses only G and F clefs, which won't be to everyone's taste, but in my experience it's the form that's accessible to the largest number of people. The only thing to look out for is just that these two clefs with a little 8 at the bottom are written an octave higher than they sound. So this is of course the first time that we hear the famous subject that forms the basis of the entirety of the Art of Fugue. My favourite book on fugue is Ebenezer Prout, or Prout, I'm not sure how you pronounce it. He outlines some key guidelines as to what makes a good fugue subject. So let's apply these guidelines to Bach's subject here. Firstly, it should have a clear tonality. The first 4 notes are all notes of the D minor chord, and the next note, the C sharp at the beginning of bar 3, rises to D in that very powerful semitone upward movement characteristic of the leading tone resolving to the tonic. Very clearly then, we're in the key of D minor. Secondly, a good subject tends to be a complete musical phrase. Bach starts on the tonic note D, finishes with a formulation that involves G and E, falling to the tonic note D, which means that this can be harmonized as a leading note triad or dominant to tonic cadence. And it ends on an accented beat. These are all features that together make something sound like a complete musical phrase. 3. Generally, it's a good idea for the subject to have a fairly narrow compass so that it's easier to avoid overlapping parts. This subject goes down only a semitone below the starting note and a fifth above the starting note, meaning that its maximum range is just a minor sixth. 4. The subject can start on any note, but generally it tends to be the dominant or the tonic, and as we've already seen for this subject, it starts on the tonic note D. Finally, a subject should have a distinctive character, with a well-defined melodic contour and a well-marked rhythm. Interestingly, although we have this nice undulating melodic contour that brings us back to the same note we started on, the rhythmic contour is not hugely distinctive, and this is a very conscious decision on Bach's part. The mixture of minims, crotchets and quavers means we have just enough rhythmic profile to make it memorable, but not so much that Bach is going to feel tied to this rhythm as he moves forward through this monumental collection of fugues. In fact, one of the features of the Art of Fugue is the way Bach varies the rhythmic profile of the subject, and this becomes a key way of maintaining interest throughout what is a very long work. So we've had the subject in the alto voice. What comes next is the answer, that is a transposition of the subject, usually in the dominant key. Bach has chosen to give this in the soprano voice. So we've had an entry in the alto and then the soprano. This pattern of answering a lower voice with an upper is then replicated by the bass followed by the tenor. This order of entries, alto, soprano, bass, tenor, is mildly unusual because it means that the final entering voice is in a middle part. Usually the final entry of an exposition tends to be in one of the outer voices because this makes it more clearly heard when you have all of the parts sounding at the same time. To get around this, Bach keeps the D in the bass stationary when the tenor voice enters. What this means is that we only have 3 active voices here, so that the tenor, the entering voice, sounds to the ear effectively as an outer part. Interestingly, in pretty much every other edition I've seen, and recorded performances, including the one by Sokolov that we're using here, this D is written and played as a minim. This intrigued me, so I contacted Christian Mondrup from the Werner Icking Music Archive, who prepared this edition, and he pointed out correctly that J.S.Bach's handwritten score does indeed have a semi-breve here, and that it was the edition finalized by C.P.E. Bach just after his father's death that introduced the minim. It seems likely that this change was made for exactly the reason we're discussing. In other words, by having a minim there, there's a rest that allows that tenor voice to really come through. The second important thing to notice about this answer is that it's a tonal answer. There are two types of answer in a fugue, real and tonal. A real answer is where the intervals of the subject are transposed exactly to the new key. We know what a real answer would look like in this case because Bach actually gives us one in bar 29, so I've pasted it here, meaning that we can compare this real answer with both the subject and the answer that Bach actually gives us in bar 5. The subject starts with a perfect fifth. The real answer does exactly the same, then it drops a major third, same in the real answer. And this exact transposition then continues right up to the penultimate note, this C to B flat being a tone rather than the semitone in the subject. This is just a small tweak Bach makes for harmonic reasons that we'll talk about later. So this is more or less what a real answer would have looked like. But we can see that Bach didn't actually do that in bar 5. Instead, the first two notes are different, meaning that the first three intervals are different. The answer has a perfect fourth rather than a perfect fifth, and a major second instead of a major third. After that, the real answer and the tonal answer are the same. So why has Bach changed the notes here to create a tonal answer? Well, to understand that, we first need to understand the harmony. So let's take a look at the subject. We're in the key of D minor, and we remain in D minor throughout the subject. In other words, it doesn't modulate, and we finish with that implied cadence in D minor. The role of the answer is to respond to the subject in the dominant minor key, A minor. Now, it would have been possible for Bach to go straight to a real answer here, but the problem is that it starts with a leap from A to E. These are the tonic and dominant pitches of A minor respectively. This leap begins the answering phrase, and is clearly therefore heard as an echo of the corresponding leap at the start of the subject, which acted to define D minor, the key of the subject. Because of these two factors, the fact that it consists of the two most important notes of A minor, and secondly, the fact that it mirrors the key defining position of the opening bar, this leap from A to E would give a strong impression of modulating already to A minor at the very beginning of the answer. This is possible if the accompanying part is handled well, but it's rather abrupt, and there's a risk of the E, the supertonic note, the second note of the tonic key, really sticking out. So instead, a tonal answer allows a smoother transition. By going up to D rather than E, and keeping us initially in the tonic key of D minor. Then the C natural and the B natural ease us nicely into A minor, which the G sharp confirms. This is why there's a general rule in fugal writing that if you start with a leap between tonic and dominant, it's preferable to have a tonal answer. But personally, I find it much easier to actually understand it from first principles than trying to remember all of these rules. So once all four voices have stated either the subject or the answer, that constitutes the end of the fugal exposition. We've had the subject in D minor, the tonic, the answer in A minor, the dominant, return of the subject in the tonic key, and the return of the answer in the dominant key. And this answer comes to an end in bar 17, at which point we enter what I'm going to call the development section. But before we leave the exposition, let's just go back and have a quick look at what the other voices are doing when they're not stating the subject or the answer. After it's finished stating the subject, the alto continues with free counterpoint to accompany the answer in the soprano. The soprano then also carries on with a free counterpoint when the bass enters, the alto also continuing. When the final voice enters, the bass remains stationary as we discussed before, while the upper voices continue. And then once the tenor has had a chance to make its statement of the answer clear, the bass then joins in again with free counterpoint. If an accompanying counterpoint recurs in a systematic way throughout a fugue, then it takes on a life of its own and we call it a counter-subject. But that's not really the case here. Fundamentally, the main consistent feature of the accompanying material is these short to long kicks that we first hear in the alto and then in all the accompanying voices throughout. Once we leave the exposition and enter the development, notice how Bach reduces the texture to 3 voices, the alto falling into silence. Bach does this firstly to give our ears a bit of variety and a rest from the full-on 4-voice texture, but also because for these 6 bars, neither the subject nor the answer is present, and by leaving the alto silent, Bach emphasizes the return of the subject in that voice here. A section after the exposition where the subject and answer are both absent is traditionally called an episode. Episodes help to avoid repetitiveness so that we're not constantly hearing the subject or answer. And they're often also used to create some harmonic interest. Surprisingly though, Bach chooses not to undertake a full modulation to another key at this point. When the subject returns, it does so in the original key of D minor. As we can see here, the episode ends in a very similar place to which it begins. But between those 2 points, Bach winds his way through a series of transient modulations using what many people would these days call secondary dominants, but which are, more importantly, founded on this bass line, rising in semitones and then dropping down the diatonic scale. Above this foundation, the upper voice takes its lead from the end of the exposition, sequencing this motif up in thirds before coming back down again as it returns to the motif in its original form. Meanwhile, the middle voice does the same, but with the long note falling on the beat so that we get this lovely, staggered, imitatory feel to the passage. So at this point, the subject returns as we said. It's accompanied as before with the familiar short to long kicks, but we also get these clear anticipations of the quaver part of the subject, and this immediate echo of the stepwise scale leading to it. And it's worth noting that these 3 notes are an exact repetition of that part of the original answer. This leads to another very brief episode, before the next thematic return 2 bars later, again preceded by rests in the entering voice so that our ear is drawn to it as it re-enters. Some analysts seem to tie themselves in unbelievable knots around the implications of this entry. For example, one writer summarizes a fellow academic's position as follows. He states that between bars 29 and 44, Bach deconstructs the concepts dux and comes. He refers to a rhetorical trope, metalepsis, that holds that what precedes can only be understood through what follows. The past does not determine the future, it is the other way around. Time is out of joint. Derrida calls this a spectral moment. It is a moment that no longer belongs to time, if one understands by this the linking of modalized presence, past present, actual present, now, future present. Obviously I'm quoting out of context, that's actually a very good article, it's very interesting, I've linked it in the description, but we're going to take a slightly less philosophical approach. The debate arises because this iteration of the theme can be seen either as a real answer in A minor, which is how I referred to it when we were comparing it to the tonal answer earlier in the video, or it can be heard as a transposition of the subject from D minor to A minor. How you view it will then determine how you view the subsequent entries. But really the key word for me here is view. To me this doesn't have much to do with what we hear. So although it may be important for the task of an analyst, for those of us approaching it from a compositional perspective, it doesn't really make any difference. Whatever we call it, fundamentally it's the theme, it's in A minor, and it's back. Meanwhile, we get the quaver submotif in accompaniment, and personally I hear an augmented, expanded variant of it here as well. Most prominently, we get this fragment of the theme, which is a kind of amalgam of the perfect fourth leap at the start of the tonal answer, which we heard in bar 5, and the major third drop that characterizes the real answer. This tricks our ear for a second into thinking that we're going to get a stretto. A stretto is defined as a section in which entries of the subject or answer follow one another at a shorter distance of time than in the first exposition. So by that definition, This fragment, together with the next entry, which comes in a bar before the preceding entry has finished, could be considered a stretto. But it's so brief, and the first fragment breaks off before the next entry starts, that it doesn't really sound like a stretto to me. It's another one of these situations where how we name things isn't really the point. What matters is what we hear. To me, it's interesting that the entry in bar 32 is not preceded by a rest, whereas the fragment highlighted in green is, so that the green fragment feels like a shy, tentative, false start. What we end up with is a beautiful interweaving of thematic material that gives a sense that momentum is picking up, as if we are approaching a significant point of change. It turns out that the change that's coming is our first, and indeed only, proper modulation into a key that isn't either the tonic D minor or dominant A minor. The characteristic leading note of A minor, G sharp, shifts to G natural, and instead we get the leading note of G minor, F sharp. This shift into G minor has actually been subtly prepared by Bach right at the start of the piece. If you remember, the subject fell by a semitone here, but in the answer, unusually, the interval was echoed by a tone, C to B flat. At the time, this seemed like a surprising decision. It's certainly not something the textbooks would advocate. Again, we get that F sharp, the leading note of the G keys, propelling us to the G. Some would say tonicizing the G, with the B flat above giving a sense of G minor, the subdominant, the 4 chord of D minor, and therefore easing us back into the tonic key. So we shift into G minor with this new entry, which starts like a tonal answer on A, rising a perfect fourth. But whereas the original tonal answer in bars 5 to 9 then dropped a tone to C, this drops a semitone to the C sharp. And perhaps the biggest difference is that the A then drops a full minor third to F sharp instead of just a semitone as it did in the original tonal answer. These changes are to allow for the harmonic movement that's going on, as well as to provide variety, and I must say I particularly like this version of the theme. The theme disappears again, and we have a 4-bar episode, again suffused with those characteristic short long kicks and held together structurally by this ascending scale line from C sharp to B natural, and by, like the previous episode, this motif in the bass, staggered with the same motif in the alto, rising in thirds. This brings us to an A chord, which moves to a D minor chord so that we have a dominant to tonic movement in D minor. This is then reiterated with the A to D minor movement firmly establishing that we're back in the tonic key of D minor. This return to the tonic corresponds with the entry of another variant of the answer in the tenor voice, this time with a perfect fourth followed by a major third, and entering on an E, a distance of a fifth from the preceding entry. As ever, Bach is always giving our ear something fresh. He's always varying the detail. He never allows himself to be confined by rules for the sake of rules. The theme is, of course, accompanied by the short to long kick rhythm, and we also have hints of the descending quaver motif in various forms. We enter another episode, powered by these up and then downward scale lines, before a false entry of a perfect fourth anticipates the entry of a full answer in the soprano. We also get an anticipatory hint of the end of the theme. And then we enter an episode that leads to what I'm going to call the recapitulation. The episode focuses on that same quaver drop from the end of the theme, gives us another anticipatory leap of a perfect fourth, and then brings us to the return of the subject in its original form and key of D minor in the bass, which has been silent for almost 7 full bars. The return of the theme in the original key is the signal that we've entered the final section of the fugue. And in keeping with common practice, you'll notice that from the beginning of the recapitulation to the end, each of the 4 voices is continuously involved in the counterpoint. Bach creates a link between the preceding episode and the beginning of the recapitulation by retaining his focus on that tied, long note and quaver rhythm. And he likewise uses this to move smoothly into the final and longest episode with this sequence in the bass that again moves in thirds. Harmonically, Bach is giving a tip of the hat to the only harmonic player in this drama that isn't either the tonic or dominant, namely G minor, which is pointedly tonicized here. By tonicized, I mean that he doesn't really fully modulate, but he directs the ear very strongly to the G minor tonality through the use of the leading note, F sharp, and the E flat, tones that we find in G minor but not in D minor. So G minor is briefly given prominence, but we don't settle there. Instead, we come to this held A in the bass. A is the 5th note, the dominant note of D minor, and this procedure of sustaining the dominant tone whilst the harmonies change around it is known as a dominant pedal. The effect of the dominant pedal is one of suspense and anticipation. It stops the music moving forward harmonically. It's a signal that we are in the final straight now, and our ear is waiting for the moment of release. And I think that's why Bach emphasizes these leaps of fourths and fifths, the intervals that open the theme in its various forms, as if Bach is teasing our ear, telling us that the theme is coming, but not quite yet. The dominant pedal continues to bar 65, and the episode builds in intensity, marked again by those short to long kick rhythms, and by this same motif rising again in staggered thirds, until we arrive at something we have not yet had for the duration of the fugue: silence. Used judiciously, silence is one of the most powerful weapons in the composer's armoury. Our ear is hanging on this diminished harmony with its clear dominant tendency wanting to resolve onto the tonic, which it does, but the D minor chord is in second inversion, the least stable of the triad positions, so it doesn't feel settled. In fact, we would expect this to resolve onto a dominant chord, an A, like a classic cadential 6/4. But instead we get this gorgeous detour to a diminished 7th chord built on G sharp, what some would refer to as the secondary dominant of A, which then does indeed resolve onto A. And we complete a full, authentic cadence, but landing not on D minor, but on D major. This tradition of sharpening the third of the minor tonic chord at the end of minor pieces dates back a long time and is known as tierce Picardy, the Picardy third. So we've arrived at a full cadence on the tonic. The episode is complete. We could finish the fugue here, and in fact, apparently it did actually end here in Bach's first version. But in its final form, Bach adds a coda. He bases this on another pedal, this time a tonic pedal on the tonic note D. Harmonically, there's a final nod to G minor, those E flats and F sharps again, and we get a final iteration of the theme, starting on the dominant note A this time, rising a perfect fourth and dropping a major third, pretty much the same way as we heard it beginning on E in bars 40 and 49, but with the final quaver motif altered to go up a third rather than a step. This is to accommodate the harmony, but it also has the rather pleasing effect of directly imitating the end of the answer as it was originally heard at the opening of the piece. In fact, that three-quaver rhythm is evoked throughout the coda. It forms the end of the theme, and is the last thing we hear in the whole fugue. So in the coda, Bach is anticipating and easing into that ending, anchored in the tonic pedal, allowing the energy to dissipate. There are so many things I love about this contrapunctus. The simplicity of the subject, which is even more remarkable when you think that it's designed for all sorts of contrapuntal gymnastics later on. The perfectly balanced sense of form. The fact that there's no formal counter-subject, so that Bach is demonstrating to the student what can be achieved before we even get into matters of double counterpoint. The way that Bach has managed to create unity in the accompanying material without having that formal counter-subject. The simplicity of the harmonic scheme. There's far less modulation than we would usually expect. But most of all, I just find it incredibly beautiful. And that beauty does come from all of those things that we've talked about. But it also comes from Bach's priorities, I think. This work was intended as a pedagogical aid. Bach intended us to study it in the way that we've been doing. But instead of giving us a Cherubini-esque textbook fugue, instead of saying, here's the template, follow this, Bach's very first message to us in the Art of Fugue seems to be that it is the art of fugue that matters, not the science. That technique only has value when it serves an end that transcends the means. And whatever kind of music we make, I think that's something we should all aspire to.